In the village of Harlenden, where the thatched roofs leaned wearily over dirt paths and sheep wandered more freely than women, the feast of St. Valperga had drawn a crowd. Smoke from wet logs curled over the chapel yard, mixing with the scent of spiced pottage and horse sweat. There, amid the bustle of songs and sermons, a girl named Edhild, aged 4, stood on a stool to be seen by a notary who carried more ink than emotion. She wore a linen shift too large for her bones, belted clumsily with a cord that had once tied a sack of barley. Her hair, thin and fair as a lamb's first coat, had been combed for the first time in weeks. She did not know what the word betrothed meant, only that it came with ribbons and dried apples, and that her mother had sewn red thread into the hem of her tunic, a color not for saints, but for sealing contracts. The man beside her was named Godric. He was 14, though the lines around his mouth told a different age. His hands were nicked and blackened from the forge, his shoulders too square for the boy he once was. He had never spoken to Edhild before today. He didn't speak now. A nod sufficed. This was not love. It was land, obligation, and cattle yet unborn. Around them stood witnesses, none surprised. For in this corner of England, marriage was not a culmination of longing but a strategic weaving of family cloth. The Church had frowned on such young unions, yet rarely denied them. A bishop might bless a future coupling while privately recording the age with clerical unease. Yet ink could dry before bodies matured. Edhild's mother, Wulfwyn, watched with a face like hard bread, worn, useful, and without indulgence. Her own marriage had been brokered at the age of 6 winters. She still bore the scar of a fever caught on the bridal journey. She knew what came next. The years of waiting. The fostering, the slow folding of a girl into wifehood like wool turned into warp. For now, Edhild would return to her mother's hearth. The marriage, so ceremonially declared, was more alliance than arrangement. Godric would return to his master's forge. In 6, perhaps 7 years, if the girl lived, the household of his father would send for her. The notary closed his ledger. The priest gave a terse blessing. The villagers clapped without cheer. In this world, childhood ended not with growth, but with contract. And though the union would not be consummated until Edhild's body ripened with the blood the Church watched for, her name was now tethered. She was no longer hers alone. That night, as rain pattered on the wooden slats of the hut roof, Edhild lay curled on a bed of straw and wool scraps. Her thumb grazed the red thread at her hem. She did not understand what had happened, but she knew something had changed. Her doll was no longer a child's toy. It was a thing she must now put away. The seasons changed, as they always did in Harlenden, without mercy. Spring brought mud that swallowed boots and lambs alike. Summer dried the wells. Autumn turned the hedgerows brittle, and winter scoured the bones of the village with winds sharp enough to find every chink in a wall of dung and wattles. Edhild, now 6, was not yet a wife in practice. But in name, in gossip, and in the eyes of those who counted hens and daughters with the same weary arithmetic, she was already taken. When she passed the bakehouse, the women would nod and murmur, "Godric's girl." Not with cruelty, just with finality, as if it had always been so. Her mother no longer corrected them. There was no schooling, no play. Childhood, as a concept, had not been invented. What little time her mother no longer corrected them. There was no schooling, no play. Childhood, as a concept, had not been invented. What little time a child owned was a shadow borrowed from the labor of adults. At 6, Edhild was binding rushes for floor mats. By 7, she turned the spit when meat was roasting, rarely their own, more often her lord's. By 8, her fingers were coarse from carding wool, pricked red from sewing seams she would never be proud of. No one asked if she wanted this. That question belonged to another world. Godric visited only once that year, walking the 8 miles from his forge town under the burden of apprenticeship and expectation. He was taller now, his face furrowed by heat and responsibility. He did not speak to Edhild, not properly. He nodded when introduced again. She curtsied as taught. Then he gave her a small iron brooch, an awkward heart, crooked at one edge where the mold had failed. She accepted it in silence. That was affection in their world. The next day, he left before the crows stirred. At night, Edhild would sometimes sit beside her mother, combing lice from her sister's hair, and ask questions no one wanted to hear. "What does a wife do?" Wulfwyn would answer carefully. "She wakes before the hearth and lies down after the last spark fades. She keeps the fire fed and the children from dying. She brings food and gives warmth and buries the babies that don't cry. And if the Lord's kind, she'll have time to grieve. What if I don't want to?" "Then you hope," said her mother, "that you're not the only one." That winter, a girl from the next village died in childbirth. She had been 12. Her name was never spoken, only whispered. She was married early, they said, meaning too early. But no one called it strange. Only sad, and perhaps inconvenient. Edhild heard this while gathering moss to stuff into wall gaps. The girl's name echoed in her mind for days. Not in horror, but in recognition. She was old enough to understand that her name, too, was tethered to a future her hands could not yet touch. Still, each night she ran her fingers over the red thread sewn into her oldest tunic, now too short at the wrists. It was fading, worn by washings and wear, but still there, binding her to a man she had spoken to once, binding her to a life not yet lived. By the time Edhild turned 9, her limbs had begun to stretch in quiet rebellion against the years of toil. Her hips still narrow as a boy's, her breasts only hinted at beneath layers of wool, but she had begun to bleed. It came late, after months of whispered watching, women taking note of stains, of flushed cheeks, of cramps that bent her small frame over the midden heap. When the blood came, her mother only nodded. No celebration, no congratulations. Just a slab of cloth sewn into a belt and a thicker cloak for modesty. There was a word the women used now. Marriageable. It didn't mean she was ready. It meant she was no longer exempt. The talk began soon after. The midwife remarked that Edhild would need more fat if she were to take a man properly. A cousin brought marrow broth. A neighbor sent curdled milk with clumps of barley. Food, precious, rationed, was quietly diverted to her bowl, not to nourish her strength, but to soften her. This was the bride fattening season, though no one called it that aloud. She was made to sit more than work, to stitch rather than spin, a gentling of the hands, a whitening of the skin. Godric's mother had written. They would send for Edhild in midsummer. The household was readying a corner for her. She would be received as a daughter, and in time, as a wife. "She's lucky," said the alewife. "Some girls are taken at once, before they even bleed." Lucky. A word as blunt as an old blade. Meant to comfort, but dulled by overuse. Edhild's dreams grew strange. She dreamt of sheets stiff with blood, of chickens laying bones instead of eggs. She woke with a clenched jaw and dry mouth. She didn't speak of it. Dreams were not welcomed unless they spoke of saints or storms. One evening, her father carved a little stool for her journey. A bride's gift, though he didn't say so. She watched the shavings fall like snow. The legs were uneven. It wobbled slightly. But it was hers. On the day of Pentecost, she was made to bathe in warm herbs. Mugwort, sage, and a twist of rosemary floated in the wooden tub. The water was barely enough to soak her knees. Her mother scrubbed her back in silence. Her sister wept behind the curtain. Then the red thread was cut from her tunic, folded, placed in a cloth bundle with her few possessions, a comb, the iron brooch, the lopsided stool. That night, Edhild was not permitted to sleep with her family. She lay alone in the croft, on a new pallet, its straw still sharp and rustling. The fire burned low. She stared at the rafters, tracing each beam like a memory. At dawn, she would be led away. Not stolen, not sold, but given. And though she was not yet wed in body, in spirit, in mind, she had already vanished. They arrived before sunrise. 2 men from Godric's household, one a brother, one a servant. Neither smiled, but neither frowned. This was a duty, not a joy. They came with a cart drawn by a weary grey mare and bearing a small chest lined with linen. It would carry Edhild and her dowry both, a comb, 2 woolen tunics, a carved stool, and a bundle of herbs meant to sweeten the bed straw. Edhild did not cry. She had done that already, days ago, quietly and without ceremony beneath the sheep pens. She wore a shift of bleached flax, her hair braided back so tightly it tugged at her scalp. Her mother had added a dried sprig of thyme at her throat, not for fragrance, but for courage. Thyme was for warriors. She sat in the cart beside her bundle, legs too short to reach the edge, hands folded like a nun. Her father did not wave. Her mother touched her brow, then turned to feed the fire. That was farewell enough. The road was rough, carved by hooves and seasons, and it jostled her bones like a warning. They passed fields heavy with oat grass and barley just turning gold. Edhild watched them without wonder. Each hill was a reminder that she would not walk this path again, not alone, not as Edhild. By midday, the sun was a hammer, and the cart finally creaked into Godric's village. It smelled of forge ash and boiled nettle, the scent of a place that expected things to break and be mended. A group of women came out to meet them. Godric's mother, a thick-bodied woman with arms like bannocks and a face lined by smoke and decision. 2 sisters, red-eyed and silent, and a girl no older than Edhild, already carrying water for the next meal. There was no welcome song, no procession. This was not a wedding. This was a transfer. Godric was not there. "He's at the smithy," said one of the women, wiping her hands on her apron. Edhild was led inside, not into a chamber, but into the storeroom where herbs hung from the beams and the floor was dry. "You'll sleep here," said Godric's mother, laying down a folded sack, "until your courses run true." That was the custom. The wife-child must prove her bleeding was regular, her body steady. Only then would the full rites be done. Until then, she was betrothed in name, a wife in practice, but untouched. They gave her barley bread and warm milk thick with skin. She ate without tasting. That night, Edhild lay on the pallet and listened to the sounds of this new house. The coughing of a child, the thump of a kettle lid, a dog pacing the hearth. She pressed her face to the cloth bundle beside her, where the red thread still nestled like a fossil. She was not afraid. That had passed. But she missed the sound of her mother's breath. And she missed, most of all, the version of herself who had once chased frogs in the stream, bare-kneed and unwatched. That girl was gone now. What remained was a quiet breath, rising from a borrowed bed, beneath a borrowed roof, in a life being shaped like hot iron, slowly, and without her permission. The house of Godric's family was larger than Edhild's own, but it did not feel grand. It felt like a chest with too many things inside. Every corner bore the signs of work: baskets of wool, copper pans with soot-blackened bellies, a wooden cradle that hadn't rocked in years but still held a sleeping cat. The hearth was always alight, its warmth uneven, too fierce near the iron pot, too faint by the door. Edhild was not idle. From the second morning, she was given duties: sweeping rushes, grinding meal, feeding hens that pecked with jealous fervor. These tasks were not unfamiliar. She had done them at home, but here, each action was observed. Not harshly, but precisely. Godric's mother had the eyes of a mason. Nothing escaped them. Hands too slow, she murmured. Elbows too wide. And once, after Edhild scattered barley meant to be soaked. A wasteful wife is like a broken roof. Let's patch that before the rain comes. There was no anger in her tone. Only efficiency. Godric still hadn't spoken to her. He returned late each day from the smithy, arms dark with soot, eyes clouded by exhaustion. Sometimes he acknowledged her with a glance. More often, he passed her like a broom in the corner, useful, inevitable, unworthy of comment. He was not cruel, merely preoccupied, and unsure, perhaps, of what to do with a child wife who watched him as if he were both jailer and brother. They had not spoken since the day of the brooch. Edhild learned quickly. She learned not to sigh when her back ached, not to cry when the butter wouldn't come, not to speak at meals unless spoken to. She learned to fold linens without creases, to tend a sick chicken without sentiment, to smile when visitors asked, "Are you the new little wife?" At night she would lie on the pallet in the storeroom, listening to the heavy steps of Godric's father overhead, the muffled snores of someone too tired to dream, and the wind teasing the shutter. The straw poked her through the sack. A mouse once ran across her feet. She did not scream. She only shifted and tucked her toes under the cloth. Her own mother had once said, "Marriage is like a cold stream. If you wade in slowly, it hurts longer." Edhild now understood that wisdom was less about comfort than endurance. On Sundays, she was brought to chapel, seated on the bench between Godric's mother and a spinster aunt who whispered every line of the Psalter aloud. The priest looked at her with the vague curiosity of a man unsure whether to bless her as a child or admonish her as a woman. She preferred when he ignored her entirely. One evening, Godric's mother brought her a length of dyed cloth and a needle. "You'll start your own linens. Better they carry your stitch than mine." Edhild touched the thread. It was red. Her hands shook at first. But she stitched. And stitched. By Edhild's 12th winter, the household had ceased to treat her as a guest. She was, without fuss or blessing, a wife in all but consummation. Her chores had become routines, her voice quieter, her spine straighter. She walked with a deliberate grace born not of vanity but of necessity. Girls who stumbled were often scolded, and scolding meant attention, and attention could mean shame. The bleeding had come and stayed, monthly now, regular as the moonrise. No more watching, no more whispering. The family began to plan. There would be no feast. No garlands. No trumpets of heraldic pride. The law did not require it. The church permitted marriage by consent alone, words exchanged in present tense before witnesses, with no priest necessary if none could be found. In rural parishes like this one, ceremony often followed practice, not the other way around. Still, Godric's mother insisted on a blessing. The priest, old and suspiciously fond of mead, agreed to say a few words after Sunday Mass. That would suffice. Edhild was told the night before. "It'll be done at the chapel door," said her mother-in-law. "You'll kneel. He'll answer. You'll answer. Then that's the end of the waiting." The waiting. As though that were all it had been. That morning, the cold was bitter even for February. Edhild wore a cloak of dark blue wool, borrowed from one of Godric's sisters who had joined a convent. It smelled faintly of lavender and mildew. Her hair was combed back and bound in a linen veil. Her hands were chapped but clean. Godric stood beside her at the chapel door. He was 17 now, with shoulders that filled his tunic and a voice that had deepened into gravel. He still did not smile, but he looked at her, properly, for the first time in years. The priest cleared his throat and asked the question. Do you take this woman, Edhild, to be your wedded wife? I do, Godric said without hesitation. And you, Edhild, do you take this man? She did not pause. She had rehearsed the words, quietly, in the barn while grinding barley. I do. There was no kiss. That would have been unseemly, especially in front of the villagers who lingered like shadows at the gate, unsure whether to bless or gossip. A handful of oats was thrown in token celebration. Someone muttered a psalm. Then it was done. They walked home side by side. Not touching. Not speaking. The wind bit at their cheeks. A dog barked in the distance. The road was half frozen, pocked with hoofprints and meltwater. At the door of their home, Godric held it open. Edhild stepped through. No longer a child. No longer a girl. A wife. In full. The red thread had long since frayed from her hem. But its binding had never needed to last. She had been sewn into this life long ago, with expectation, not silk. With silence, not ceremony. The hearth in the main room burned low, casting soft amber light across the uneven walls. The others had gone to bed early, or pretended to. In such a household, privacy was never granted, only approximated. Tonight, a woolen curtain had been hung around the bed. It fluttered faintly in the drafts that slipped beneath the door. Edhild stood at the edge of the bed, her fingers clutched around the edge of her shift. The linen was coarse, freshly washed but stained at the seams. Godric sat on the edge, back straight, staring into the flames. He had washed too, his hair still damp, his face scrubbed until it glowed with an unfamiliar boyishness beneath the soot-stained tan. Neither of them spoke. There were no words taught for this. No guidance beyond whispered warnings, half-muttered by older women who had long since swallowed their own fear. The church had offered its instructions, that the act be modest, purposeful, without sin. But modesty was not clarity, and purpose was not comfort. Edhild shifted her weight. The cold of the floor seeped into her soles. Godric finally turned. I won't, he began, then stopped. His hands flexed in his lap. You can lie down. You must be cold. It wasn't tenderness. It was uncertainty. He had spent his youth learning to strike metal until it obeyed, but flesh was not iron, and wives were not tools. Edhild nodded. She lay down on the straw mattress, clutching the woolen blanket around her body. Godric joined her slowly, as if he feared breaking something. For a long time they lay side by side, their backs not touching, the only sound the pop of the fire and the distant shift of livestock in the barn. Then, at last, he reached for her hand. It was calloused. So was hers. They did not kiss. There was no softness, no ecstasy, no romance. Only two people bound by law, by family, by a script older than either of them. He entered her carefully. She winced, not from pain, but from the certainty of being watched, not with eyes, but with expectations. Afterward they did not speak. Godric rolled away, his breath heavy, not from pleasure but from the weight of duty performed. Edhild lay still. She did not cry. Instead, she watched the rafters overhead, the same rafters she had stared at her first night beneath this roof. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She was 12. She was a wife. Her body no longer belonged only to herself. Later, when she rose to relieve herself by the back door, she saw a patch of blood on the sheet. Small. Expected. A sign that all was well. It would be laundered and examined. Quiet approval would follow. She returned to bed, pulled the blanket over her, and lay down beside her husband. He was already asleep. The rooster's crows split the still dark sky before the hearth had even faded to ash. Edhild stirred from a shallow, broken sleep, her limbs stiff, her hips sore in a new way. Not bruised, not battered, only altered, as though her body had reshaped itself in the night to accommodate a future it had never asked for. She rose before Godric. That was the order of things now. Wives rose first. The fire needed coaxing. She blew gently on the embers, fed them with dry moss and shavings, then added a few twigs. The flame caught slowly, indifferent to her wedding night. She moved through the motions of boiling water, crumbling yesterday's bread, slicing onions that made her eyes water in a way she pretended was from the smoke. Godric emerged as the sun brushed the eastern shutters. He did not meet her eyes, nor she his. That, too, was expected. The awkward silence of new spouses was not considered rude, merely temporary. Eventually, comfort would replace it. Or habit would. Few questioned the difference. At breakfast, Godric's mother passed her a cup of small beer and said, "You'll sleep in the big room now." Her tone was flat, but not unkind. She offered a folded square of cloth, clean, with a faint whiff of lavender. "Wash well." The others, Godric's younger siblings, the old aunt, the neighbor's girl who helped on wash days, said nothing. They ate as usual, picking at porridge, slurping from spoons carved long ago by hands now dead. If they noticed Edhild's careful posture, the slight wince when she sat, they did not comment. The world did not pause for her transformation. The hens still needed feeding. The bucket still had to be hauled from the well. Her body might be different now, but the cabbage did not care. Later that day, she joined the women in the yard, scraping lye soap across stained linen and wringing it with a strength she did not yet feel. The talk turned to the price of barley, to the new tax levied on plowshares, to the midwife's daughter who had married a man with a clubbed foot but 3 cows. No one mentioned love. No one mentioned choice. That night, Edhild shared the bed with Godric again. This time, he touched her shoulder before lying down. A small gesture. Almost a kindness. They did not speak. They did not embrace. But he breathed more softly than the night before. And she found, to her surprise, that the silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft, awkward threads of something growing, not love, perhaps, not yet, but something slower, older, a kind of endurance, shaped by repetition and shared space. She slept more deeply, and dreamed of fields she had never seen, where no names were spoken, and no blood was remembered. The mornings came colder now, with frost clinging to the windows like spider's breath. Edhild rose early, as always, her fingers stiff, her back tight from restless sleep. She bled that month, and the next, and the next. But something in the rhythm felt off. She'd grown quieter. Not from obedience, but from caution. People were watching her. It began with Mirwith, the midwife, commenting too flatly, "You've been married long enough." Then a glance from Godric's mother, lingering, pointed, when Edhild poured out the remains of a childless broth. Then a whisper from the woman who sold onions. "Some don't carry. Some never will." The words were not cruel, only firm, and they clung to her like soot. She tried not to feel the shift in Godric's silence, a new stiffness in his jaw, a shorter nod before sleep. He had not spoken a word of children since their wedding. But now, each month her bleeding returned, he seemed a little more absent. One evening, returning from the well, she found the chapel door half open. Inside, the priest knelt in dim light. She stood in the threshold, and before he noticed her, she heard him murmur, "Bless the empty ones, Lord." Make them fruitful. Or make them obedient. She stepped back. No one had said she was barren. But the word lived in the walls now. She began to work harder. Kneaded dough until her wrists ached. Scrubbed until the stones bled her knuckles. She laughed more loudly when spoken to. She nodded faster. She ate whatever was served, no matter how sour. And then, one morning, her bleeding stopped. No fanfare. No prayer. Just silence. The old signs returned: dizziness, aching bones, a strange heat beneath her ribs. But this time, she told no one. She waited. Weeks passed. The women still watched. But now their eyes narrowed in suspicion, not pity. One muttered, "Perhaps she used herbs." Another said, "Perhaps the first was a punishment." Edhild said nothing. She carried water. She fed the hens. She worked as though her body were a borrowed thing. Until one morning, while lifting the bucket, her breath caught a sudden shift inside. Not pain. A presence. She whispered to herself, "You're here." And the wind in the eaves shifted. It no longer sounded like judgment. It sounded like waiting. Winter deepened, and so did the quiet within Edhild. Her belly had not grown, not the way the older women said it should. Her breasts remained tender, her appetite uncertain, but no life stirred beneath her navel. There was no flutter, no shift, no swell. Only the aching knowledge of something promised, then taken. She bled again on the Feast of Candlemas. Not the tidy, monthly flow she had known before. This was heavier, darker, accompanied by a pain that folded her in half beside the hearth. The blood soaked through the wool of her shift, onto the rushes, staining them with a rust-colored memory. She said nothing at first. Not even when Godric found her crouched and pale, the fire gone to embers. He knelt beside her, one hand hovering above her shoulder. "You've bled?" he asked gently. She nodded. He said nothing more. That night, the house moved quietly around her. Godric's mother scrubbed the stained rushes without comment. The old aunt placed a dried clove in a cloth bundle and tucked it beneath Edhild's pillow. No one offered false comfort. There were no midwives called. No prayers sung aloud. Loss, like birth, was a private rhythm, kept behind the curtain of ordinary life. Still, the village knew. Whispers drifted like wood smoke. She was too young. It was her first. It happens. No one blamed her. But no one expected her to mourn out loud, either. In the days that followed, Edhild worked as usual. She fed the hens. She boiled oats. She helped replaster the cowshed wall with lime and straw. Her hands moved without thinking. Her mind stayed curled like a fist. At night, she lay with Godric, neither touched nor touching. His warmth beside her was not a comfort, only a reminder of what might have been. On the third night, he reached for her hand beneath the blanket. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the first time she had ever heard him say those words. She turned to him. In the half-light, his face was unreadable. "So am I," she whispered. For the first time in their years together, in all the years since the red thread was sewn into her hem, they wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Together. Two children wrapped in adult lives, mourning a child who had never had a name. By spring, the bleeding had stopped. So had the weeping. The soil thawed. The lambs were born. And Edhild, though thinner than before, began again. Because there was always another season. And in the world she had been stitched into, a wife was many things, but never allowed to be undone. Harvest drew near, and with it came the rhythm of scythes and sickles, the ache of sunburnt necks, and the scent of earth opened too early each morning. Edhild worked beside the other women in the fields, binding sheaves, scratching sweat from her brow with straw-blistered hands. Her skin had browned. Her arms had grown sinewed, shaped not by choice but by survival. It was in the fields that the true voices of women were heard, low, steady, unrecorded. "You bled again?" asked Aelith, the baker's wife, her voice barely louder than the rustle of barley. Edhild nodded. "Good," the woman said. "Means you're still whole." It was not meant cruelly. In their world, the womb was not a sanctum, but a measure. A sign of worth, a future, of legacy. That evening, a girl named Tilda came to Edhild's door. She was 14, broad in the hips, face still round with girlhood. Her wedding was in 2 days, to a man she barely knew but whose oxen were strong and whose father had 3 barns. "They say you manage the hearth well," Tilda said. Edhild invited her in without speaking. They sat by the fire. Edhild gave her a bowl of milk thickened oats and did not stir when the girl wept into it. After a time, Tilda asked, "Does it always hurt?" "Not always," Edhild replied. "Did he love you?" "No. Not at first." "And now?" Edhild stirred the embers. "We are kind to each other." Tilda wiped her face on her sleeve. "Is that enough?" "It has to be," Edhild said. Before the girl left, Edhild placed a sprig of yarrow in her hand. "Keep this near. It eases bleeding and fear." Tilda nodded, clutching it like a relic. Edhild watched her go, remembering her own first night, the silence, the pain, the distant firelight. She did not envy Tilda, but she pitied her. For in the years since her own thread was tied, Edhild had come to see that marriage was not just a bond between 2 people. It was a folding in of the self, a slow burial of the girl beneath the weight of necessity. Later, as Godric returned with soot on his brow and bread under his arm, she did not speak of the visit. He nodded at her, set down the loaf, and washed in the basin. "You worked late," she said. "The bellows broke," he replied. They ate in silence. And when they lay down that night, she placed her hand on his chest, and he did not flinch. In a world that took so much without asking, sometimes the smallest gestures were the truest form of mercy. Autumn came with mist and wood smoke. The barley was stored, the apples wrinkled in their baskets, and the hens molted half their feathers in a communal protest against the cold. The hearth was never without flame now, though the woodpile dwindled faster than it could be restocked. It was then, without fanfare, that Edhild's body changed again. No bleeding this time. No cramps. Just a slow, warm thickening below her ribs, the same floating dizziness as before, but steadier, calmer. The whisper of a heartbeat that was not her own. She waited 3 weeks. Then 4. Still no blood. Then came the nausea, the heat behind her eyes, the sudden hunger for sweet milk, and the smell of soil. This time, she told no one. She simply began to walk more slowly, to wrap her shawl tighter, to keep a hand at her belly when the road jolted her too sharply. At the end of the 5th week, Godric noticed. "You're pale," he said. "Ill?" She shook her head. "No. I'm sure now." He understood. His face did not brighten, but he reached out, not to touch her, but to steady himself on the edge of the table. "Good," he said. Then, quieter, "Good." From that day, the house shifted. Godric fetched water without being asked. His mother brought fresh rushes for the sleeping mat. Even the old aunt began mumbling protective prayers over the cauldron, where she stirred broth rich with marrow and garlic. Edhild ate them all. The women resumed their watching, but this time they did not whisper. They advised. Walk slowly. Rub oil into the skin. Keep a sprig of marjoram near your bed. Never lift a bucket above your heart. Edhild listened. She folded her days around this forming life as though it were a candle in wind, steady, precious, and easily lost. Each night, she lay still and waited. And then it happened, a flutter. Not pain. Not pressure. A ripple, soft as the wing of a bird passing beneath water. She gasped. Godric turned beside her. What? She reached for his hand, pressed it to the spot. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, I felt it. That was all. But it was everything. In that moment, Edhild was no longer only a wife. She was becoming a mother. And in a world that seldom gave women a name beyond who they belonged to, this was a kind of freedom. The sky turned brittle with frost. Chickens huddled in corners, breath rose in clouds from every beast and body, and boots cracked stiff from freezing where they'd been left too close to the wall. Edhild's belly now curved forward like the round of a loaf mid-rise. Strangers no longer needed to ask. They knew. You'll bear before planting, said the midwife, a woman called Mirwith who smelled of tallow and thyme. If the snow breaks early, maybe under moon's turn. If not, well, hope your man's hands are steadier than mine. Mirwith visited each fortnight now, checking the slope of Edhild's spine, the firmness of the womb, the pulse behind her ears. Strong, she said. Quiet sort, though. That's the kind that comes fast, or doesn't come at all. The words sat heavy in Edhild's chest. Her days slowed. The task shrank. Others lifted the buckets. She was not permitted to stoop, to climb, to kneel. She stitched when her fingers did not swell. She sang to herself softly in the afternoons, not because she believed in soothing the child, but because silence had begun to feel too large. Godric watched her differently now. Not as a task-sharer. As something unknown. Sometimes she'd catch him staring when he thought her asleep. His eyes not afraid, but distant. As though he were weighing her against fate itself. When her waters broke, it was not with thunder. No scream, no shout. Just a warmth between her legs and the slow, sure press of something moving downward. She was spinning flax on the bench when it began. She stood. Let the spindle drop. Then walked to the door and said, He's coming! And the women came. Not just Mirwith, but 3 others, old Sitha with her poultices, Marjorie who had birthed 7 and lost 4, and young Wina who hadn't yet borne a child but knew how to boil linens and bite back tears. They took over the house. Godric was sent to the barn. The children were packed to the neighbor's hut. The fire was stoked until the walls sweated. The shutters were latched. Curtains hung. A basin set. And the waiting began. Edhild bore it in silence for the first hours. Her lips pressed white. Her hands gripping the carved bedpost so tightly her knuckles ached. When the pains came harder, she screamed. But not for mercy. Only to stay. The women spoke little. Their hands were everywhere, wiping, pressing, lifting, soothing. They rubbed her thighs with oil. They whispered prayers half folklore, half scripture. Hold on, girl. He's almost here. He's got your patience, stubborn little sprout. No blood where it shouldn't be. That's a mercy. Time became meaningless. There was only breath, push, silence, and push again. And then, a cry. Sharp. Guttural. Alive. The women laughed. Mirwith held the bundle up in her blood-slicked hands and announced, A boy. Godric was brought in an hour later. He did not speak. He looked at Edhild, her hair matted, her shift stained, her arms cradling the wrinkled, red-faced creature. Then he knelt by the bedside and touched the baby's hand. It's all right, he whispered, more to himself than to the child. Edhild stared at them both. She had not wept in years. Now she did. Not from sorrow. Not even from relief. But from the strange, aching knowledge that for the first time since her hem was stitched with red thread, she had done something that was entirely her own. The fire had not gone out since the child's birth. For 3 days it was fed without pause, with kindling, with breath, with the heat of small miracles. That was the custom. A newborn's first nights were sacred, thin-veiled, too near the other world to risk darkness. Cold could call them back. So the hearth glowed, and everyone took turns watching. Edhild sat upright with pillows tucked behind her, the baby tucked in the curve of her arm. His skin had settled from scarlet to something pale and soft, flecked with milk rashes and downy hair. His eyes were shut more than open, but when they blinked, they were the same gray as morning frost. Godric had built him a cradle. Rough oak, nothing carved, but solid. Edhild had lined it with the same cloth that once held her red-threaded tunic. Not out of sentiment, out of completion. Mirwith returned on the 3rd morning to weigh the infant in a cloth sling and inspect Edhild's bleeding. Both, she declared, were as they should be. Then she nodded toward the child and asked, "What name will he carry?" Edhild had known the answer for days. She looked at Godric. He nodded. "Bryn," she said, "for the hill where I first felt him stir." A simple name. Not noble, not sainted, but rooted. That afternoon, the priest was summoned. He grumbled about the frost and brought a chipped bowl of holy water, still half frozen at the rim. He wet the child's forehead, mumbled the Latin rite, and made the sign of the cross with fingers more stained by wine than ink. "Benedictus sit," he muttered. "God keep him from hunger, pestilence, and poor harvests." No more was needed. The boy was now inscribed in the village memory, his name spoken, his soul marked, his mouth kissed with salt and ash. After the priest left, the house filled with neighbors. Women with nettle pies and loaves of brown bread, men with flasks and grunts of approval. Children whispered and crept near the cradle like it was some rare beast. Godric stood beside it all, one hand resting lightly on Edhild's shoulder. He didn't speak often, but when someone joked that Bryn had his father's ears, Godric smiled, a small, crooked smile, but real. That night, when the last feet had left the threshold and the fire crackled low, Edhild lay awake beside her son. He breathed in small, snuffling sighs. Her own body ached, but she didn't mind. She had bled. She had broken. She had delivered. And now she watched, not in fear, but in awe, as a life that once lived only beneath her ribs breathed beside her, warm, real, and terribly small. She kissed his head. Then, finally, she slept. Time thinned. The urgency of birth gave way to the long, repetitive grace of survival. Days folded into one another like fresh dough before the fire. Bryn grew steadily, not robust, but well enough. His cry was strong, his appetite stronger. By summer, he could grasp a wooden spoon and gum it with fierce, senseless determination. Edhild returned to her work gradually. She kept Bryn close, tied to her chest with a sling made from her old shift. He slept there as she churned butter, laughed as she rinsed flax, and shrieked when startled by the geese. The village women nodded when they saw her. A good mother, they said. Calm. Diligent. The child always clean, always fed. No airs, no complaints. But it was the older ones who whispered more deeply. "She was married young, that one," muttered Doda, who had outlived 2 husbands and all her teeth. "And yet," replied Wyna, who still remembered the red thread in Edhild's first tunic, "she came through." They never said it outright, not in front of her, and never where the priest might hear, but among themselves, they wondered. What made some girls thrive in soil meant to choke them? What allowed one 12-year-old wife to become not just a mother, but something more solid than most? She listened, Mirwith once said. Not just to words. To silence. Godric, too, had changed. He no longer looked past Edhild. He looked at her. Sometimes he brought her things without saying why. A spindle smoothed from ashwood, a bit of salted cheese tucked in his palm, once even a blue feather that had landed near the forge. He had never said he loved her. But he now sat beside her while she mended, and asked how much wool would be needed for Bryn's winter coat. They spoke more, sometimes of nothing, sometimes of things deeper than either expected. Once he said, "You're not the girl I married." She paused. "Do you wish I were?" He shook his head. "The girl I married didn't know how to keep bees alive through frost." She laughed. A small, surprised laugh. The first in a long time. Evening after evening, Bryn toddled at their feet, chasing dust motes and gnawing old spoons. He grew teeth. Then words. Then opinions. One day he asked, "Who gave me my name?" Edhild said, "I did." "Why?" "Because you came to me like the wind over the hill, soft at first, then all at once." He blinked, then nodded, as though this made perfect sense. And in the quiet that followed, Edhild realized what the others had never fully seen. She had not only been given a role, she had shaped it. She was no longer the girl with the red-threaded hem, nor merely the wife of a boy blacksmith. She was the mother of Bryn, the keeper of bees, the speaker of silences. The girl-wife had vanished, and in her place stood a woman no one had chosen, but who had, somehow, chosen herself. The loom had been broken for years, its wooden frame warped from damp, its heddles frayed by mice and misuse. Edhild found it beneath the eaves of the barn, half hidden beneath sacks of rye. Godric offered to burn it for kindling. "No," she said, touching its worn frame. "It still holds." That winter she restored it. Slowly. A dowel here. A new beam carved from seasoned oak. Flax thread twisted by her own hand, spindle spun in the long hush of evening, while Bryn dozed by the hearth. It was the work of months. Not for coin, not for praise, but for something deeper. Something quiet. When it was ready, she began weaving. Her first cloth was coarse, uneven. But it held. A shawl for Bryn. Then a tunic lining for Godric. Then finer work, linen for kerchiefs, a strip of red for festival. A child's belt embroidered with a single oak leaf. Each thread told a story she could not speak aloud. One day, as the wind scraped the shutters and snow threatened, she stood in the doorway, watching Bryn and two other children chase each other between the henhouse and the well. They squealed, tumbled, laughed, their voices high and sudden as sparrows. Godric stepped up beside her. He carried a bucket in each hand, breath steaming from his beard. "He's fast," he said, nodding to their son. Edhild didn't answer. She was watching Bryn's bare feet kicking up dust from the snowless patch near the threshold. The same place she had once stepped through, aged 12, a wife only in name. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what it would have been like to wait?" Godric was quiet. Then, "I do. But if we had, we'd have no Bryn." A pause. She nodded. "Then again," he said more softly, "maybe we'd still have you." She turned to him. The wind caught her veil, lifting it slightly. Her hair was streaked with sun-bleached brown now, her face thinner. But her eyes were calm. "No one had me then," she said. "Not really." That night, as snow finally fell, slow, hushed, heavy, she sat by the fire, weaving again. This time, she stitched a length of cloth not for wear, but for memory. White linen bordered in red. She stitched the shape of a thread, winding, imperfect, unbroken. She would never display it. But she would keep it. Because though no one had asked what it meant to be a wife at 4 or 12 or 20, she had learned. It meant being made into something before you knew your shape. But it also meant, one day, learning to cut your own cloth. The loom sat silent that spring, its last warp stretched and waiting. Edhild spent her mornings in the garden now, stooping over onions and beans, her hands dirt-caked but sure. Bryn followed her with a stick he called a sword, chasing shadows. Godric mended the shed roof, pausing now and then to glance toward them, a quiet look, unspoken but full. Visitors came less often now. Their house was no longer new. Edhild was no longer whispered about. She had become part of the village's pattern, not threadbare, but essential. One morning, the widow Elditha came knocking. She carried a scrap of wool, stiff and stained. "I've no daughters left," she said. "No fingers for this. I heard you stitch steady." Edhild welcomed her in. No payment was offered, none expected. Women did these things for one another, not because they were saints, but because no one else would. As she worked, Elditha watched her fingers. "You always knew how to sew?" "No," Edhild replied. "I learned to stitch hems when I was 5. But to make cloth, that came later." Elditha nodded. "There's a difference." "Yes," Edhild said. "Stitching binds what's given. Weaving makes something new." That night, as the stars emerged like pricked holes in a black cloth, Edhild stepped outside alone. She looked toward the hill where she had once felt Bryn stir. The barley was not yet planted, but the soil was ready. Her body was not what it had been. Her hips ached in the rain. Her hands stiffened at dawn. But she was strong. She remembered the first brooch, the crooked heart, the red thread, the first night. None of it had broken her. It had shaped her. And in that shaping she had found a kind of power. Not the kind sung of in halls. Not the kind etched into church windows. But the kind that outlasted names. She would never be remembered by scribes. Her face would not be painted. But her thread would remain. In the cloak Bryn would wear next winter. In the cradle she'd line for a neighbor's babe. In the prayers whispered over fresh bleached linen. In the silence between stitch and stitch. A story not told, but lived. Years passed like soft rainfall, unnoticed until everything was wet. Bryn was nearly 10 now, taller than the bench that once served as his bed. He ran errands alone, corrected younger children with the solemn authority of those who remember hunger, and no longer reached for Edhild's hand in the market. Still, he kissed her cheek when no one watched. Edhild's loom creaked less often. Not from disuse, but because she chose her moments now. No longer out of need, but rhythm. The last cloth she wove was white and fine, for a neighbor's burial shroud. The widow's son had come in silence to ask. Edhild didn't speak. She simply began. When it was finished, she washed the loom's frame, oiled its joints, covered it with a plain cloth, folded once. "It's ready for rest," she told Godric. He looked up from sharpening his awl. "You too?" "Not yet." But something had shifted. That spring, Godric built her a small table beside the window. No one asked why. She didn't explain. There she began to write, not with ink, but with thread and scraps. A kind of record shaped into quilts and patches, each square a piece of someone else's story. A child's first steps, a lost goat, a winter miscarriage spoken of only once. She stitched them in silence. A memory for each seam. One afternoon, Wina, the girl who once boiled linens during Edhild's first birth, came to visit with her own newborn. "I don't know how you did it so young," she said, rocking the baby with tired arms. "I was nearly 20, and still I feared it would kill me." Edhild didn't smile. "It nearly did," she said. "But I didn't know I could say no." Wina blinked. "Would you have?" "No," Edhild answered after a moment. "But I wish someone had asked." That night she dreamed of her first tunic, the hem with red thread. In the dream, she was still small, watching it unravel. But she didn't stop it. She let it fall away, thread by thread, until she stood in her shift, shivering. And then she turned and walked forward. When she woke, Bryn was crouched beside her bed, polishing his boots for the spring festival. He grinned when he saw her eyes open. "You're always last up now," he teased. She tousled his hair. Not because he was wrong, but because he was hers. And she, once stitched, once sold, once shaped by others, now lived in the life she had slowly, stubbornly woven from silence and survival. The looms slept. But Edhild did not. The air turned sweet with late summer rot, apples bruising in the orchard, damp wool hanging too long on the line. Bryn, now tall enough to reach the eaves, had taken to mending tools and arguing with his father about firewood. Godric no longer won these arguments easily, but neither did he try too hard. Edhild moved slower now. Her joints ached before rain, her eyes tired with less light. Still, she rose early. Always had. She no longer needed to, but habit has its own reasons. She milked less, cooked less, but stitched always. A little each day. One morning, she found her first tunic in the bottom of a cedar chest, gray with age, the red thread barely visible. It was shorter than she remembered, its seams uneven, childish. She held it in her lap a long while. Then she began to undo the stitching, gently, reverently. It came away like breath. That night she sat at the window table, the old red thread looped loosely in her palm. Godric came in from the forge, wiping soot from his brow. "What are you making?" he asked. She didn't look up. "A thread doesn't have to become cloth." He tilted his head. "Sometimes it only needs to be seen," she said. He didn't reply. He placed a mug beside her elbow, warm and bitter with herbs. "I see it," he said after a moment. She nodded. Later that season, when Nearwith fell ill, Edhild tended her. Cooked broth. Mixed poultices. And when the old woman slipped away in her sleep, Edhild laid her out in the very shroud she had woven 2 winters before. "She knew," said Wina, touching the linen. "She knew you'd be the one." Autumn fell again. The leaves flared and dropped, bright as dying embers. And one morning, Edhild didn't rise at dawn. Godric found her at the window, the red thread in her hand, eyes closed. Not gone. Sleeping. She woke before midday. Sat up. Smiled faintly. "I thought I heard my name," she said. Later that week, she wove one final piece, small, plain, stitched with red along the border. No pattern. No message. Just the shape of what she had carried, and what had carried her. She folded it. Placed it beside her comb, her spindle, and the broken iron brooch she had never thrown away. Then she covered the loom once more. And rested. Edhild died in early winter, just after the last apples were pressed, when the village still held a touch of warmth in its breath. It happened gently, without struggle, the way snow begins, almost unseen. She lay beneath her quilt, the one stitched from stories, her breath slow and shallow, her hands folded with a scrap of red thread between them. Godric sat beside her, his hands no longer blackened from the forge. Bryn stood at the door, taller than both, jaw tight, eyes dry. Grief would come later, in the quiet moments, when the house creaked, or when the loom stood untouched too long. Word spread quickly, as it always did. "She was only 12 when she came," said Alditha. "Quiet as a shadow. She made my wedding cloth," Wina added. "Held my firstborn when I couldn't. She buried Mirwith," muttered another. "Knew when to speak. Knew when not to." No one mentioned the red thread at first. Then one old neighbor said, "I remember when she arrived, hem-stitched with crimson. Barely past a babe." And then, somehow, they all remembered. She had not been noble. Not saintly. Just steady. Just present. At her burial, no priest preached long. There were no relics. But women came bearing things she had made, shawls, kerchiefs, stitched bands. Quiet work. Enduring. Bryn placed her final cloth, the one with the red border, at her feet. Godric said nothing. But he held her spindle, and placed it gently in the earth. They covered her in silence, broken only by wind through bare branches. Afterward, the house stood still. Bryn sat at her window table. The loom, untouched, seemed larger now. He didn't uncover it. Not yet. But one day he would. For his daughter. Or another girl, stitched too soon into someone else's story. And he would teach them what his mother had lived. That thread can bind. But it can also be chosen. And even when given in silence, it can still, someday, become a voice. Years passed. The house still stood. The hearth still smoked in winter. But the silence Edhild left behind had become something else. Not absence, but a presence quieter than words. Bryn married a miller's daughter, strong-handed and red-cheeked, who did not flinch at ash or blood. Together they had 2 children, both girls. And in time, one of them asked, while kneeling at the chest by the window, "Who made this?" She held up the red-bordered cloth, delicate now with age, but intact. Bryn took it gently from her. Smoothed its edge. "My mother. Was she rich?" "No." "Was she someone important?" He paused. Then said, "Yes. Though not in the way people write down." His daughter blinked thoughtful. "She stitched her name?" "No," he said. "But she left it, all the same." And so, the loom was uncovered again. Not by him. But by her, the granddaughter, who learned to work the treadles with small, curious feet. Who held the old red thread between her fingers and whispered, "I'll make something." And Bryn, watching from the door, saw her become part of something older than history, yet more lasting. A woman, shaping cloth from silence. A girl, threading strength through linen. Not just a wife. Not just a mother. A weaver of her own life. And so the story, Edhild's story, did not end in the earth. It was passed, thread by thread, stitch by stitch, into hands that would never know the weight of a brooch too heavy for a child's chest, but who would feel, in the weave, the truth of what once was. And what must never be forgotten.